So what is Blendif? It's a feature that's actually hidden in the layer styles that I think is an untapped resource. This is like your little bag of magic fairy dust, okay? Not everyone's gonna have it. Everyone has it. They just don't know how to reach into that bag and use it, but you're going to, okay? It grants unprecedented control over the highlights and shadows. And I say this word, it's a big word. I mean, that's like, what, a $5 word for it does awesome things, okay? Because once you realize what it can do with those highlights and shadows, you're gonna see the unprecedented power of it too. It becomes a way of life. This becomes something that every time you do something in Photoshop, you're gonna say, I wonder if I could use Blendif with this, or could Blendif somehow be incorporated in this, or imagine what I could do with this if I tapped into that resource of Blendif. So I like to divide a single layer into 4 different parts. So there is the opacity and fill, which everyone knows opacity and fill. We use it all the time. There's the blend mode, which is that little thing that we're kind of scared by sometimes because when we hit it, it does really sometimes unpredictable things if we don't know what those things are. And then there's the mask, which again, this part kind of scares people. And then there's layer styles. And you're like, well, where layer styles? Well, where was that my whole life? I didn't even know what that is. Or if you're a designer, you probably use layer styles all the time. Because layer styles are the place where you find drop shadows. They're the place where you find bevel and emboss. It's also the place where you're gonna find Blendif. So it's hidden, it's in this little place. And there's many times in my life where I wanna just contact Adobe and be like, hey, can you put Blendif somewhere else? But then I'm like, no, let's keep that our secret. You know, let's keep Blendif our thing. I don't want anybody else to know about this until I do a whole class on it on Creative Live, and then everyone knows about it. So I don't want you to think this as a one or nothing thing. So I don't want you to say, okay, well, it's in layer styles, so I'm just gonna use layer styles. What I want you to get to the point of, what we'll get to the point of here actually is, I'm gonna show you where these things are in the layer styles, but don't think, okay, well, I use Blendif, I can't use a mask, I can't use a blend mode, I can't use opacity. Think about what happens when you stack the potential of all of these things. So a lot of times in my workflow, what would happen, my early workflow, I'd have 9 layers that all did the same thing that one layer could do, but I didn't know how to use all of these things effectively to make that one layer very powerful. So if we talk about workflow here, it makes things easier, it speeds things up, it's lighter on your hard drive because you're not saving PSD files that are 4 gigabytes large. I don't think you can do that anyway because Photoshop will scream at you. But the idea here is that it's not just, okay, well, now I know Blendif, I'm only gonna use Blendif. It's no, I know Blendif, and maybe you take some courses on masks, or maybe you take some courses on blend modes. Take all those things that you learn, compile them together, and then see what you can do with Blendif. It knows no bounds, okay? It really does not know. It lives in a boundless territory too, especially when you see what we can do with Blendif. But here are some ideas that we're gonna go over in this course specifically. We're gonna talk about Blendif with noise reduction. We're gonna talk about Blendif with sharpening. We're gonna talk about Blendif with sky replacements. We're gonna talk about Blendif with portrait retouching. Maybe I should just stop saying the word Blendif. We're gonna talk about textures. We're gonna talk about vignettes. And we're gonna finish it up with color grading. All of these things are things that you can use Blendif for that are gonna make that one thing that much better. This is just a small little selection of ways that I can get you introduced to this. Then I'm gonna release you to the wolves, so to speak, of Blendif so that you can start thinking about how you can incorporate it into your workflow. So I don't want you to say, well, Blake said I can only use this for noise reduction, sharpening, sky replacements, portrait. No, that's not true. You can use Blendif for anything. It knows no bounds, okay? So now you know no bounds too. So the first thing we have to do before we jump into the things with noise reduction and sharpening and all the crazy cool things is we have to talk about Blendif, the principles of it, and what happens with Blendif and how this Blendif things work. So I've made a little diagram here that makes it a little bit easier for you to follow along. I chose the color magenta for a couple reasons, and this is a really good knowledge for you when you're working with masks or anything that you need to visually see something. Magenta is a great color to use for that, because magenta doesn't typically show up in our images. You know, when you take a picture with the camera, you typically don't see a whole lot of magenta colors in there unless you add those magenta colors. So by default, masks might show up in Photoshop somewhere as a red color or a white color. Well, there's red and white in our images. So if we try to look at that mask, it's gonna be very difficult to see it. So you're gonna see how I add color overlays for the color magenta. So I apologize for your eyes, because it can be a very blah, like at you color. None of us are actually wearing magenta in here. See, it doesn't show up that often in our lives either. But when we're doing diagram-based stuff, it really helps to see how these things work, okay? So the way Blendif works is it's inside every single layer. So it's not necessarily a tool like curves or hue saturation adjustment layer. Blendif is in the curve and hue saturation. It's in anything that's considered a layer. So anything that you see in this layers palette right now could actually have Blendif incorporated with it in some way, shape, or form. So the way we get to it is I like to just double click somewhere next to the text or the font in the layer, and that'll automatically open up the layer styles. I believe you can also right click and say layer styles, but then I don't know where it is, so I usually just say, okay, let me just double click this because it's a lot easier. So here is where everyone starts freaking out because they're like, oh, I double click this, I'm in unknown territory. It's like the first time you reach into that magic bag of fairy dust and you're not sure what to do with it, okay? Right here is actually where you're going to find Blendif. And I want you to kind of take that word Blendif, specifically with what's happening right down here under underlying layer, cross that out in your mind, okay? Just, if I could take a Sharpie and just write all over this nice monitor, that would be awesome. And just write protect here, protect, okay? So when we think about that word as being protect instead of underlying layer, it makes things a lot more easy to think about. Because what this is actually telling you is it's saying, okay, this layer, what are we going to do with its highlights or shadows? Or underlying layer, what do you want to do with its highlights or shadows? So I predominantly will be working with this thing down here called underlying layer because I think that's where it has a lot of power and potential. So what we do with that is we have to think in terms of pixel values. So every pixel actually has a value from 0 to 255. Specifically if it's tone, it's easy. Black is 0, 255 is white. When you start getting into color, things are a little bit different because then they have an RGB value of 0 to 255 and things are just a little bit crazy. So what I like to think here is I have Blendif set to gray because that's going to be working with the luminosity of that layer. Here from 0 to 255, this is black and this is white. So if you look at our diagram, if I were to turn this little eyeball off, you see that we actually have a pixel value chart here from 0 to 255. 128 is your gray values. What you see here is 87 and 200. Those aren't magic numbers. They're just arbitrary for the sake of this tutorial, okay? So your big heavy hitters are going to be 0 for black, 128 for gray or middle gray, and 255 for white. So if I turn this layer back on and I double click inside here, and I think of protect. What do I want to do? Well, this magenta layer, let's say I've got this magenta layer on here and I want to see all of the shadows that are underneath this layer. When we think protect, I can start pulling this slider across and protect those underlying layers from being hit by this magenta color. So when I move this over, you can see the numbers moving down there really rapidly fast, and boom, once I get to 87, everything with a pixel value of 87 and below is not being affected by magenta. However, the caveat here is that there is no mask involved, there is no luminosity mask involved, there's no opacity involved. This is basically saying this magenta, if anything underneath this is that dark from 0 to 87, do not affect it at all, okay? So if I press Alt or, so if you look right here, it's like got this really like kind of chiseled hard edge. The cool thing about this is if you press Alt or Option, there's always hidden things in Photoshop, right? My suggestion to you is if you're ever working in Photoshop and you want to know if it does something else, press Control and do it, press Shift and do it, press Alt and do it, press Control and Shift and do it, press Alt and Shift and do it, press Control, Alt and Shift and do it. And you'll find something hidden, okay? So if we press Alt or Option and we click on this slider, there's a little halvesies mark there, right? If we press Alt or Option and click on that, watch this, we can feather it. So now what we do is we say, okay, magenta, you can affect anything from 0 to 87, but if it's got a pixel value of 2 to 87, I want you to feather it in and make it a nice smooth transition. Likewise, on the other side of this, if we move this over here, if we take our highlights adjustment slider and we move this over to the left, boom, we're at 200, right? Again, it's got that hard edge on it. So we're saying magenta, you can't affect anything that's from the 200 pixel value to 255. And this is not just with tones. This is also with colors. So anything that has a 200 to 255 range in that color, it will not affect that as well. Okay, so it's easier to think about things in terms of tone than it is in terms of color, because when we bring color involved, we have millions of different things instead of 255. I'd rather work with 255 things than a million. Now if we press Alt or Option, we can maybe say, let's feather this over to 128 into the midtones. So now if we look at that, this magenta will not affect any of the highlights. It won't affect most of the shadows. It'll be basically shadow dependent into the midtones. And you're like, Blake, that's cool, but what purpose does this serve? Thank you for asking. Think about things like noise reduction, because we're going to get into noise reduction. When you reduce the noise on something, do you want to reduce the noise globally? I don't. I want to reduce the noise locally, because where does the noise typically exist? It's going to exist in our shadows. So if we do a heavy-handed, I mean, I'm talking you can obliterate the pixels with noise reduction in the shadowy areas, and then incorporate Blendif into that layer, it will protect all of the mid-tone to the highlight areas and only allow those shadow areas to get that smooth noise reduction that we put on there. So you'll see how that works in a second. The other thing I'm going to talk about, because I don't really talk about it too often, but the one on the top called this layer. So we need to use a different diagram for that, because if I say this layer, which is this one right here, if this layer, which is magenta, has any black in it, drop it out. If this layer, which is magenta, has any white in it, drop it out. But the tricky thing about that, especially when using a solid swatch of color like that, is it's just going to drop it out as soon as you get to what the value is of magenta. So the actual value of this magenta color is about 105. So once it gets to 105, it drops it out. So it's kind of difficult to think about things with this description with this layer. So we're going to do this. We're going to open up this little thing that I prepared here, which will show us this layer. So if I double click on this right here where it says this layer, notice how this layer that we're working with has black transitioning into magenta and white transitioning into magenta. So when we are working with this layer, we're saying this layer, drop your shadows, or this layer, drop your highlights. And then we can even also incorporate the underlying layer. So drop your shadows, drop your highlights, and protect the underlying layer's shadows. That's where things get a little bit like, okay, dude, you just went a little too fast. So I have to teach it to you. I have to show it to you. Now we're going to get into the practical application of this so you can actually make heads from tails from this. Otherwise, you're just going to be sitting here like, okay, that's cool. Magic fairy dust. I don't know how to use it. So we're going to do our noise reduction and our sharpening on here. So I'm going to zoom in on this image specifically into areas where I have noise. So it's pretty much going to be in my shadow areas. But I also want to find an area that not just has shadowy noise, but also has a little bit of highlight that I can work with in there too. So maybe somewhere back here would work out pretty well for me. So I'm going to zoom in pretty close. So I'm going to duplicate this layer. Anytime you're working with Blendif, especially on noise reduction, you don't want to do it on your background information because that's the important stuff. So if I had a series of layers underneath this, like a curves adjustment layer, hue saturation, all the work that I'm doing, I would essentially do a stamp. But because I just have my background layer and I'm just starting out, I can just press Command or Control J. And I'm actually going to call this noise reduction. It's always a good habit to name your layers, okay? Because I used to do composites that had 100 layers deep, and I'd be like, you're like, which layer was that? Well, now the cool part was back in that day, they didn't have this really cool thing where you could look up your layers. Yeah, just name them, makes it easier. Especially if you know how to type. Reduction, there we go. Good job, Blake. I probably still spelled it wrong, but it's really small, so I can't see it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Filter, we're going to go to Noise, and we're going to go to Reduce Noise. Now, I know a lot of people don't feel very strongly about this noise reduction in Photoshop. They feel it's substandard, they feel it can't do what it needs to do, because when we do noise reduction in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, we have the ability with a lot more sliders to do a lot more things and protect things along the way. Whereas here we don't. Because whether that's because Adobe just doesn't think they need to update this, I don't know. I haven't talked to them, they don't talk to me. So, but maybe it's because there's other tools that we can use along with this, that this is good enough if you know those other tools. And that's kind of what my assumption is going to be here. So if we zoom in a little bit into that background, you can see that when I click on that preview, we're going from like detail to losing everything. And that's actually okay with this method of noise reduction, because we have a couple different tools that we can go with this. So I like to do things pretty heavy-handed. So if we think of like Commando, you know, like you ever seen Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Like he just goes in, he dives in, he's like, ah. That's how I like to handle my tools. Dive in, get as hardcore as you can, and then taper off. You know, like maybe they should say, okay, hey, come on back a little bit. So maybe he went in there a little slower, maybe a little more surgical. But so I go a little heavy-handed, and I go heavy-handed on purpose because I know that I can taper those things back with what? I know I can taper it back with my opacity and my fill. I can taper it back with the blend mode. I can taper it back with the mask. I can taper that back with Blendif. So I've got all kinds of tools that I can taper back that commando attitude with. But when you go in there with that, the thing is if you try to like fine-tune things and just be really nitpicky, and then you do something like, oh, that looks great. And you come back and then you turn the eyeball on and off, you're like, it doesn't look any different. Yeah, so you really got to make sure that you go that commando route. Okay, so that's just a little workflow tip for you. So you might be thinking, dude, that is some wicked noise reduction that you're doing there. What I would do here is, typically this is a smaller image. It makes it a little bit faster for doing tutorials and stuff. But I've been known to put my strength up to 10 here, bring that preserved details down even a little bit more. For this image, we'll just go about 25. And I usually reduce the color noise quite a bit because noise is an interesting thing. We call noise in Photoshop, but you don't know noise until you have 3 boys running around your house. Okay, that's noise. Noise can be a very nice thing in a photograph if we call it grain instead. But we can't call it grain instead until we reduce the color noise. Because back in the film days, when we had analog film, we'd actually pick a film that had a faster ISO because it made a beautiful grain on the photograph. Well, now we call that noise. We're throwing something that was an art form back in the day into a bucket of things that are just gross. Nobody wants noise in their photo. Well, the thing we don't want is color noise. So if we reduce the color noise pretty heavy, that's okay. And we'll bring the sharpen details just up a little bit. We'll just drop it down completely because we're going to sharpen this afterwards anyway. So now when I press OK on this, if we look at the image, it looks like someone just like digitally smeared painted this, right? It doesn't look good at all. And that's okay because we're doing the He-Man method or like the, commando method. So I'm going to double click on this and I'm going to start using Blendif. But I'm going to teach you a little cool trick here because Blendif by itself, you're not going to see it. You're going to be just like that guy or girl who's like, oh yeah, it looks so much better. Oh wait, it doesn't look different at all. Because when you start moving these sliders to blend it, you're not going to be able to see what happens. You know what a highlight and shadow is here, but how do you see a highlight and a shadow? Okay, this is where we go to the color overlay. Because this is a layer style, it's built right into the layer. So if we turn this into magenta instead of blue, because we always use magenta, right? A very violent, eye-cracking magenta. And then we go to our blend options. Down here, watch as I start moving this. What? Are you not excited about that? I mean, like, I'm telling you, my wife is in the room right now, but in my office, I'll usually start clapping. And I've been doing this for like 5 years. I'm like, look at it, because I can see it. You know, like if you're in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom and you move a highlight slider, does it ever tell you what a highlight is? No, it can tell you when you're blowing out a highlight, but it cannot tell you, okay, Blake, you're affecting a highlight. Well, call me a control freak, but when I'm doing my workflow, I want unprecedented control. I want to know exactly what a highlight is, exactly what a shadow is. And when I'm doing noise reduction, I want to know exactly where I'm putting that noise reduction. So, where do we want to reduce the noise? Typically, we don't necessarily want to reduce the noise in the things like the midtones and the highlights because that's where detail lives. The thing about noise reduction, why we do noise reduction, is because if we use a higher ISO and then we go in and we crank up our exposure or something in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, guess where those gremlins of noise come out? In the shadows, okay? So I'm going to drop down this slider right here, all the way down, all the way down, all the way down until I start getting to my shadowy areas. Then if I press Alt or Option, I can split this and feather it in so that we get a nice transition between those shadow areas and those midtone areas. And then if I press OK on that, we zoom out here. That's all the stuff in this image that is considered that pixel value. So we have a lot of really dark areas in this image. So now looking at it holistically, I might double click this again and maybe feather this down a little bit more, maybe feather this down a little bit more. So I really know where those shadow areas are and press OK. So now you're thinking, well, it's magenta, Blake, I can't print that. You're right. But there's a little eyeball right here. You don't have to turn off the effects for all the layer styles. You just turn off that eyeball on that color overlay. Boom. We don't have the magenta there. And if we zoom in, we still preserved all of the detail in our midtones and our highlights but our shadows get noise reduced. So now I'm going to duplicate that background again, press Command or Control J. I'm going to move that to the top. And now we're going to call this sharpening. So now with sharpening, what do we want to sharpen? We don't want to sharpen our shadows, right? Because that's where noise exists. We want to sharpen things that are a midtone or into the highlights. So we need to now go into Filter, go to Sharpen, and go to any sharpen method you like. I'm going to go into Smart Sharpen. But you can do this with any type of sharpening. If you're a high pass sharpen type of person, you can do a whole global high pass and then use your Blendif. If you're an unsharp mask type person, you can use unsharp mask, which makes no sense at all, because why would you unsharp something when you're trying to sharpen it? But I like Smart Sharpen. So with Smart Sharpening, I'm just going to zoom in to an area that has quite a bit of highlight area. Now you can see my amount is set really high. My radius is set really high. The way this works is that the radius and the amount work together. The amount is how much sharpening you want. The radius is how many pixels that will affect. So if it even says we want 141% sharpening and we want that done to 64 pixels around that 1 pixel that it would be targeting, that's too much. So we're going to drop that down. We'll drop it down to about half. And then reduce noise. Do we want to reduce noise? Well, we don't really have to, because we already have a noise reduction layer here that we already have controlling that noise reduction. Now, as far as the shadows amount and the tonal width, and these are like your more advanced stuff here for your shadows and your highlights, which can still work out just fine. This is a fade amount. So really what they're doing here, but they're not telling you, is they're doing a Blendif inside here. It's sneaky stuff, because they're saying fade this sharpening effect in your shadows, or fade this sharpening effect in your highlights. You get that? So there's a lot of tools that already work with Blendif that are hidden that probably run off of the same algorithm, but they'll never tell us. Okay, so we're kind of like hacking this stuff up and decoding it a little bit here. So if I don't do anything to those highlight and shadow areas, then that amount and that radius are pretty high. But if I bring this radius and this amount up really high, and then I fade it into those shadow areas, and work with the tonal width and the radius of that pixel, it starts to reduce the sharpening within those shadow areas, or reduce the sharpening within those highlight areas, to give us a really nice, well-rounded sharpening. And if you're saying, oh, Blake says 86, 76, 41, 59, 59, 50, that's perfect, right? No, it's just for this image. Okay, so a lot of these numbers are going to be arbitrary. Don't take them just take them for what they're worth when we're working on this photo. So now if I turn that preview off, let's go somewhere like right here. We'll zoom in. Here it was before, here it is after. Before, after. We'll press OK. Again, we're doing the commando method. We're going in, all right? Let's double click this. We have our Blendif settings, right? So we want to protect the underlying layers, what? The shadow areas, because we want this to affect the midtones and the highlights. So if I move this over, guess what? I can't see anything. I mean, I can, but I can't. It's like, let me just turn on that color overlay. Boom. Go back up to my blending options here. Again, you're not going to see a little tick box for this because this is part of the blending options. Another aside on the blending options is look at the other things you have in your blending options. You have your blend modes, you have your opacity, you have your fill. These are things that are contained right here, but maybe they didn't have enough room to put a little slider there, to help you out a little bit. Or maybe you wouldn't know how to use it anyway, because sometimes that stuff's, pretty intimidating. So if we press Alt or Option, we can split this, get a nice feathered transition in. We can turn that color overlay off here, or we can do it on the layer itself, and we press OK. So now, if we were to turn these off, here's our sharpening. Really nice sharpening on our, maybe a little over sharpened, but it's over sharpened so you can see it, because if I do it normal, you wouldn't be able to see it very well. And then our noise reduction. So what we have inside here, if we turn these eyeballs off, there's the before, there's after our noise reduction, and there's after our sharpening. Okay? And that's all controlled with Blendif. Here's the really cool thing about Blendif, especially when we start getting into some other things. Anything that changes underneath a layer that has Blendif on it, if the shadows change, if the highlights change, guess what? It automatically does it. Dude! Okay. here is a photo that I took in, I'm going to butcher this, but it's Grottignan, France. And this is actually a structure that Eiffel did, aside from the Eiffel Tower. So one of my buddies took me here. It's one of his favorite places to shoot. And we went out, it was raining, slight drizzle, and I really wanted to shoot it, so I did. But I know enough about Photoshop and I know enough about my workflow that I can fake it till I make it, okay, right? So all I need is data. The data that you're looking at here, you'd probably say I would never use that in my workflow or my portfolio because it just doesn't look that great, Blake, and I agree with you. But let's go ahead and open up this guy right here. So sky replacements are always something that I think are morally okay. So let's just talk about that real quick. Some of you might be like, oh, it's not morally correct to replace the sky. Well, guess what? I'm an artist, so I don't care. I do what I need to do because I'm an artist. I'm a creative problem solver. And I know for a fact that clouds pass by this object, okay? At some point in time, these clouds could have, hypothetically speaking, existed behind this object. So, I have my Photoshop set up in a way that makes it really easy for compositing. If yours isn't set up this way, go to Edit, go to Preferences, and then under Workspace, I believe, don't prove me wrong, yep. It's right here, they usually have by default this checked, saying Open Documents as tabs. Well, when you do that, all of your images open up along the top, and I think it's a nightmare, especially because that's something relatively new for Photoshop. I go way back in the day, I started Photoshopping in 1998. So I turned that off because it makes it really easy for me to move in between images, and you just have to think in terms of layers and thinking in terms of layers, and if you're thinking in terms of layers, it doesn't matter, right? So this image right here, I'm just gonna press V for the move tool. I'm gonna click on it. I'm gonna press and hold Shift as I move it over. And when I do that, it makes sure that I don't just move it and it just gets somewhere random on the image, okay? So then if I press and hold Shift as I move it up, it's also gonna make sure that it doesn't go off of the sides, okay? So I'll move this right to about here. And this is where I'm gonna get really excited. Okay, so now I need all of that underlying layer stuff to be protected from these clouds. And you're thinking, well, why don't you just use a mask? Use your quick selection tool, make a mask. Have you seen a quick selection tool that could do something around these trees in any way that would be really easy? No, you'd be here all day, click, click, and then refine edge, refine mask, and it's not gonna work. It's not gonna be very good. So if I turn this layer back on, I'll double click it, and I'm gonna start using Blendif. I wanna protect the underlying layers, well, everything at this point, except for the highlights because there's a big highlight in the background. So if I move this over, look at that. Look at that. Oohs and ahs. All right, I should save this for the end because this is where people would wake up. So as I move this over though, look what happens back here. It looks like that witch hair stuff that gets on the trees from Olympic National Park. But that's where we press Alt or Option. We start to split and feather this over. And we have some other tools here too that we can use along the way. So I'm not trying to make it perfect. I'm just trying to get it good enough. And if we want to see any of the areas that we would have to mask out, what do? We put our magical color overlay on there. Boom. So this tells me, okay, I've got this layer set up, I've got the trees in an ideal position. So now if I put a mask on this layer, press B for my brush tool, make my brush a little bit larger by pressing right bracket key, and then just start painting, I can start painting over that magenta. I'm not painting over the magenta. The magenta is just a visual for me to see exactly where that's affecting. Oh, man, this is something I wish I would have been taught ages ago. So if you're getting this, you're like, what? I hope you are, because man, whew, I get so excited every time I do this. Sometimes I'll do it in my office just to get happy. Some people drink coffee. Blendif, give it to me. I'm good. Okay. So I'll get it just ideally where I want it to get it. And then if I turn that color overlay off, it looks all right, but the thing is, the lighting doesn't match. This would never look like this, This looks like really bad HDR, So what we need to do is we have other tools for us, right? We can take the opacity, we can start dropping that opacity to get some of that underlying layers whites to show back through, okay? Drop that opacity a little bit more. That looks pretty realistic, right? But if I look at that color overlay, there's all kinds of other things that are still happening here. Now the color overlay is not gonna be solid magenta anymore. And that's because we dropped the opacity down to about 50%, okay? So what I'm gonna do to make this a little bit more realistic is This idea behind masking is like masking doesn't have to be, you don't have to make these perfect, intricate perfect little masks. You just have to make it good enough to be, let's say, believable, you know? So I'm just making my brush really large, really, really large, and then just click right around the areas that it would be trouble areas. And because this is a large brush with the hardness down to 0, it's a very soft edge brush. So it's allowing things to just kind of very nicely transition into the image. The really cool thing about this is that now we've got a really great sky replacement. I mean, I think so. I think it's pretty darn believable, right? If I were to go into Bridge and open up another photo and be really daring, press and hold V, or press the V key and press and hold Shift, move this to the top of this image. And then if I press and hold Shift and move it up, I'm even leaving the car there. I don't even care. That's how daring I am. All right. So I'll put that right about there. If I press Alt or Option, I can steal all of the settings that are happening underneath this layer. That's the cool thing about this. Alt or Option, click inside of here, and now I've got a whole different image inside there. That's with these clouds, and that's with these clouds. It steals all the properties. It's called a clipping mask. You can put a clipping mask anywhere, where maybe you're working with text and you want the image to go inside the text. Well, if you want the image to go inside the text, you can put whatever image you want above the text, press Alt or Option, and it will know the bounds of the layer that's underneath it and automatically fill itself in with that stuff. Now, if at any time you press Alt or Option underneath there, or if something changes a slight bit, it's going to go back to looking like this because it doesn't have any of those properties. So what else can we do? Well, we can physically steal the mask. I can press Alt or Option, click on this mask, and bring it up to here. That physically steals that mask. Now we need to physically steal the other properties from it. So if I click on this layer, right click, right here it says Copy Layer Styles. Any of those layer styles that are in this layer, I can copy them and paste them onto this layer 2, which is our other set of clouds. So then if I turn this layer off and I want that opacity to come back because I want more of that, there we go. See that? But when I get over here at this point, you're going to start to see some weirdness in the trees again. So maybe this mask is not the perfect mask for that sky, but I could just go to that mask, press B for the brush tool, and then just kind of do something like that, you know? Make it really realistic. And then from here, I would continue that workflow. So what would I do at this point? Well, above this, I could put things like the curves adjustment layer or the hue saturation or anything that I would do in my workflow. Would I consider this a done image? Not by any stretch of the imagination, not with my workflow. Okay, by my workflow, this is a preliminary step. Replacing the sky is a step that I would take to build this image up, and then from there, I could then maybe pop a curves adjustment layer on top, and maybe just start doing something like this to bring out the color in the image and also, you know, darken down those tones and brighten up those highlights. But again, I'm not just stuck with that curve, right? I've got opacity, I've got the blend mode of that curve, and I've got Blendif within that curve. If it's doing a little too much to those shadowy areas, but I really like the way this works, if I double click right here, I can protect those shadow areas from the curve. See, it's never ending. You can do this on every layer. So here's my challenge to you. The next time you work in Photoshop, do this with every layer, okay? Turn that color overlay on, go up to that blending options and be like, I'm gonna use Blendif on everything. I'm gonna use Blendif in my Cheerios. Yep, there we go.
Are you interested in cinematography and don't know where to start? I'm Jim Deneau. I've been shooting feature films since 1992, and I'm here to share some of what I've learned with you. In this course, you're going to learn how to work with the director to...
This is our little man, Matthew. He's our youngest. Yeah, he's got my wife's beautiful blue eyes. He just rips right through you. But those beautiful blue eyes can be even more beautiful if we use Blendif. I love it. I feel like a Blendif salesman. So if we zoom into those eyes there, now you know you can use these tools in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom too. When you have your your local adjustment tools that you use on these things, but when you're in Photoshop and you're getting your groove going in Photoshop, you don't want to go into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter and use the tools that are in there because it's easier to do that stuff. What we can do is we can go and we can pop on a curves adjustment layer. So when I do this, I tend to use whatever layer I'm going to use first. So right now I'm using a curve. I'm going to do that first, see what happens to the image globally, and then select where I want it to happen locally, okay? So that's where we're going to start combining things like opacity and blend modes and such like that. So with this curve, I can make those eyes a little bit deeper by dropping down the darks within there. So if you're not familiar with how a curve works, it is my favorite tool, the quotes on the wall. Right here is your darkest dark areas. Right here are your mid-tone areas. And right here are going to be your highlight areas. So if you move the curve down here, you're making your darks darker or your darks lighter. You're making your lights darker or your lights lighter, okay? Now the cool thing about a curve is that when you put multiple points on there, if you put a point here, here, and here, you have your shadows segregated, your midtones segregated, and your highlights segregated. And the cool thing about that is, like, you know, you're in Adobe Camera Raw, you're in Lightroom, and you see shadows there, you move that shadow, what's it doing? Okay, it's making the shadow darker, or it's making that shadow brighter. But what if I wanted to make the darkest dark areas in that shadow darker, or the darkest dark areas in that shadow brighter, while maintaining the midtones and the highlights? Can't do it. Is your mind blown yet? See, we're even going beyond Blendif. This is the beyond section of Bed Bath & Beyond. Okay. So if we make that, if I'll just do that right here, I'll just do that. So if we make this darker, that's making all those dark areas darker. Now my blend mode is set to normal, which is going to affect the luminosity, the reds, the greens, and the blues. So if you see color come with it and not just a darkening, that's because that curve has not been told to do anything but affect the entire image globally, okay? So we're getting into deep territory here. So I'll make those darks darker, make those highlights a little bit brighter, okay? But more specifically, I'm trying to work on just the eyes. So with this mask right here, I'm gonna press Command or Control I. What that's gonna do, it's gonna invert that mask so that nothing actually happened. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my brush, a B for my brush tool. I'm going to use my left bracket key to make the brush a little bit smaller. And D to default my colors back to white and black. And if I paint with white, his eyes are going to start showing back up. And this is typically where people will stop, isn't it? Where they're like, oh, okay, I painted that mask in. We're good to go. All right, awesome. Well, what if we only wanted that to affect the darkest areas of the eye and not the brightest areas of the eye? Because if you look at what we did with this curve, we made that really dark, right? So if I double click inside this curve, and again, let's rename it, eye mask, little Matthew, and double click. Right here, I want it to stay in those darkest areas of the eyes, but I want to protect it from the lightest area of those eyes. So let's turn our color overlay on. Oh my gosh, scary little Matthew, no! He's gonna eat me. I'm gonna have nightmares about that. And he sleeps in the room next to mine. So the really cool thing about this color overlay, what you're noticing right now, is what is it also showing us? It's showing us our mask. How cool is that? Like, we don't have to go into a quick mask. We don't have to do any of that stuff. We've got that color overlay right there that's gonna tell us exactly what this mask is affecting. So not only does the color overlay help you figure out what you're gonna do with Blendif, that color overlay also helps you see your mask, which is really, really important, especially when we get into things like vignetting and stuff. So with that on, I'm gonna go back to the blending options and I'm gonna bring that highlight down. And look at that. The highlight areas of his eyes start to get protected and the deepest portions of that start to get his eyes to look like my beautiful wife's. Look at that right there, okay? If we press OK and commit to that, turn that color overlay off, look at the difference there, okay? Really boosted up the darkest area. I don't even know what that's called. Is that the iris or something like that? Or I don't know. I can never get the white part and the meaty part. Maybe I should, when I'm doing tutorials like this, know something about anatomy. But the beautiful blue part looks even more beautifully blue, okay? If I turn the effects off, that's with nothing happening at all on there. So now with this segregated, the things I can do with that eye are unbelievable. But because we also have, this is set to a curve right now, right? If we go into that curve, this is affecting the RGB, or the luminance of that curve. So here's where I can start adding some more blue to the eye. If I were to come into the RGB, change this to blue. If I bring this down, it's gonna make it more yellow. Here's where we need to start talking about complementary colors and the idea of color theory, okay? Color theory on a color wheel. I wish I had one right here. I always have one taped above my desk. If you don't have one, email me. I will send you mine. You can print it, put it above your desk. I promise not to spam you. Business ploy there. So with color theory, whatever's on the opposite side of blue is going to be yellow. Color theory, opposite side of green is going to be magenta. The opposite side of red is going to be cyan. So when we look at the curve, if I'm in the blue curve, if I bring it up, it's going to make those eyes more blue. If I bring it down, it's going to make them more yellow. So here's where you become like the mixer of paint, almost like a painter. I'm going to put a point right in the midtones, a point in the dark area, and a point in the light area. So now, look what I'm doing. I'm either removing blue from the darkest area of that blue eye or adding blue to the darkest area of that blue eye. You tell me any other tool that can do that for you. There isn't one. Because this is a curve. It works on the shadow areas, the midtone areas, or the highlight areas. So I can make the highlight areas of that darkest color of that blue more blue by bringing this up, or more yellow by bringing it down. And the effects of this are really subtle, especially when we're talking about an eye here. But it's those subtleties that will make your workflow. So if we look at the before and the after, there's the before, there's the after, really deep, rich, and that's what we're looking for in the portraits, right? We want a nice, tack-sharp focus on the eyes, not the nose, which I tend to do because I'm a landscape artist, all right? Okay. So because we have this on its own layer, though, we still have all of those capabilities to do all the things that we did in the last image, where we could put another layer on top of here that's, say, a hue saturation adjustment layer. We can boost up the saturation quite a bit, press Alt or Option, and steal all of the properties that are below that. So now this HSL adjustment layer is stealing what's happening down here. Don't do this stuff over and over and over again. Use what you have available to you. You've already done all the work to get those eyes separated and get them really nice looking. Use whatever tools you want on top of that to boost up those eyes with the hue saturation or lightness or anything you want to do at that point. Whether that's color grading, you've got unprecedented capabilities here. Okay. Where this also works out really well too with portraits is, let's say I were to make a curves adjustment layer and the highlight on his face might be a little bit too much for me. If it was, I could bring down the curves adjustment. I could double click on there, put that color overlay on there, go back to my blending options and protect any shadowy areas. So now that curve is specific to the highlights and only the highlights. Turn that color overlay off. Look at that. It's only affecting those highlight areas. The next thing I'm going to use on this is a texture. So I like this image. I've got it to a point where I think I could probably either be done or step on the teetering edge of making it a little bit more artistic. I could make this a really happy looking image based on the texture I put on it, or I can make it a really grungy looking image. So I'm going to use a texture. Now, let's just talk about textures for a little bit. A texture is just something in nature that looks tactile, that you take a picture of. That's essentially what texture is, right? When you feel something. Textures, you can find them anywhere. You can find them everywhere. This floor that we're working on here has a good wood grain texture that if you were to take a picture of this, you could use it in your images. So I take texture images all over the place, and sometimes it drives my wife nuts. We've got, and this is from our old toaster oven, when we would toast our biscuits on our little tray. And this is all like the buttery goodness that would just kind of go where the biscuits used to be, you know? But look at that texture. It's beautiful. I don't dumpster dive, but if I'm in the city, you'll find me at a dumpster. The most beautiful textures that you're gonna find for making grungy looking work are gonna be on dumpsters. Okay, and it's on the parts where like the arms go in, like to pick it up and dump it. Right there, all the paint gets scratched away. That's gold. Okay, that's gold. And there are photographers that make a lot of money just off of photographing those textures. So I mean, just some things to think about. A lot of times I shoot these textures just to give you a little bit of advice on shooting textures. I actually use my cell phone. Shoot my cell phone with the flash on, like as close as I can get. So I'm like taking a mugshot essentially of the texture, because We don't want a whole lot of highlight in there. We don't want a whole lot of shadow in there. We want a washed out texture. Because if we had highlights and shadows and we put that onto our image, those highlights and those shadows from the textures are getting put onto our photograph, and it just doesn't look good, okay? So like when I'm doing workshops and stuff and I'm walking around while, you know, the other people are taking pictures and stuff, they'll see me taking pictures with my phone and they're like, what are you doing? Like, I paid you to take pictures with your phone? And what they don't know is I'm putting those onto a little drive for them so that they can have all those textures. And that's pretty cool. So little thing for you guys to think about when you're shooting anywhere. Any environment you go to, I'll oftentimes put, take my cell phone, take about 50 texture shots. Now I've got over at least 10,000 textures in my portfolio to work with. So you're like, how am I going to use this Blendif? You went on a really big long aside there, Blake. Thank you. I know, I always do that. So we're just going to press V for the move tool. We're going to click and move this over the top. And this is just like we're working with cloud replacements or sky replacements, right? But now we're doing it with textures. So traditionally, you might have seen people use textures with blend modes. A good blend mode to use, one of my favorite go-to blend modes when I'm doing texture work, is soft light. And why? Because soft light makes darker things darker without making them pure black, lighter things lighter without making them pure white, and anything that's middle gray or close to middle gray will receive little to no effect at all. If it's middle gray, no effect happens at all. So if you look at this texture, if we change this back to normal, you can see that there's quite a bit of middle gray in here. That's why this makes a great texture. I know what you're going to do when you go home. You're going to go to your toaster oven and you're like, what does mine look like? What does mine look like? I know it, and I love it. Melted butter, like butter melting in a pan, that makes a great texture. It's beautiful stuff. So change this to soft light because that's typically where I'll start. But then, you know, when you're looking at this, and you're like, well, I wish that that texture wouldn't be running across X, Y, or Z, you know? And then you go and say, well, let me just drop the opacity a little bit. Well, that's just dropping the opacity and the effect or the flavor, essentially, of that texture. The flavor on that texture is definitely butter. So we'll double click on this layer, and now we have Blendif. So this might be something, if you've ever seen someone use textures before, they might not have gone into this territory. Again, why? Because it's that untapped resource. It's hidden within that layer that you're not going to find it unless you know to look for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn that color overlay on. I always suggest getting to that habit, especially with that magenta. Click on your blending options. And now what can we do? Well, we can say, well, anything that's in that underlying layer, protect that from this texture, period. So if we move this over, you're going to start to see our little crocodile coming back. He's like, I'm going to get you now. I see you. Right through that magenta. So if we press Alter Option, split and feather that over, bring it into our highlights a little bit more. And now, if we turn that color overlay off, that texture is not finding itself anywhere in this image in a dark area. It won't rest in any dark areas on the crocodile. It won't rest in any dark areas that are happening over here. The cool part about this, let's go ahead and double click this. Let's bring it back down. Is maybe we want to look at it from our highlight perspective. Bring this over, Alter Option. We don't have this in our highlights now. It's only affecting those shadowy areas, which creates a pretty cool looking effect in those shadow areas, right? But watch this. Wait, there's more. If I click this color overlay layer on, I'm doing this specifically because I want you to see what's going to happen when I do this, because this is the absolute power of Blendif. We're getting into the title. Okay, so if I click on this background layer, and I press a curves adjustment layer, watch this. I'm just waiting for dramatic effect here. Nothing happened. If I bring this down, look what happens. Things are getting darker, right? And that magenta is changing. If I bring it up, things are getting brighter, and that magenta is changing. Why? Why is that happening? Because we have this set, we have this Blendif set that anything that is a highlight you're not going to affect. And that's because this layer is on top. But when we put that curve underneath, as things get lighter or darker, this is automatically going to know, okay, well, you said, Blake, in this Blendif, you told me, do not affect anything that is 255 down to about, I don't know, that's probably 235. So anything that's between here, 65, and 235, right around here, you don't want me to affect. So anything that changes underneath that Blendif, if that value starts to change in that image underneath, it will not affect those areas. So as it gets brighter with that curve that's underneath there, we're seeing that that effect is not, the texture essentially is not going to be on there. We turn that color overlay off, watch how this changes. Boom. Look at that. Isn't that wild? Man, so cool. You can just stare at it and play with it all day. So cool. Turn that color overlay on and you see the difference there. Now, you still have all those other things available too. So I don't want you to think, well, okay, I used my blend mode of soft light. I used my Blendif. Well, that's about all I can do. No, you still have your opacity that you can drop here. And you still have the capability of putting on a mask on that layer and physically, manually brushing things out. Let's say, okay, I don't want this to affect that guy at all. Let's just do that. With black, not with white. Thank you for correcting me. Change my black brush. Do not affect this guy at all. And then turn that color overlay on. And as we paint on here, just to show you, that mask is showing me what? That magenta, I should say, is showing me the mask. It's showing me the Blendif. It's showing me the opacity. That's cool. That's real cool. Name a program that can do that. I'm just saying. This is in Saint-Emilion in France. This is a really cool little town if you're ever out in the Bordeaux area. It's about 40 minutes out. It's really awesome. It looks like this, obviously, because you're seeing it, but it's got like this, like, I don't know, like 1500s feel, and a lot of the newer age businesses that are in there have like, their signs aren't like, it's not like they got a McDonald's sign just sitting there in the middle of the city, you know? So we don't really see that here in America, but I like to do vignettes, and I like to do my own custom vignettes. I don't really like to use the typical vignette that you would see in Adobe Camera or Lightroom. Now, I like them because they have the ability to protect my highlights, because you see a little highlight protection slider. As you move it up, your highlights start to show through, but it's still not what I can do, and I know that, okay? So I'm gonna make a new layer here, and I'm gonna press Shift F5, if it'll work, Shift F5, on this laptop. My control button and my shift button are the same size. So, Shift F5, and I'm gonna fill that with black. Press OK. So I'll start with a black base. This is essentially the vignette, because vignettes are a deeper, darker tone. So I'll start with black. I'll even label this vignette, not spelled like it sounds. I can spell today. Vignette, and I'm gonna put a mask on there. Press B for my brush tool. And you're like, you're gonna paint with black on a black layer? Well, I'm painting with black on the black layer to reveal the stuff underneath, because that's what a mask does, right? So I'll just paint right here, just boom. Maybe I'll use my mouse for this so I don't have the Wacom effects there. Okay, something like that. So that's a really good vignette, right? No, no. There's more. So with a vignette, I like vignetting that happens from a lens. I actually don't correct for that, because I think that natural vignette looks really nice. But sometimes I take it to another level, or if there's an image that doesn't have that vignetting from the lens on there, I will put that vignette on there. So I do it manually like this. I'll drop the opacity of this to about here. But the whole point of a vignette, you want the viewer to get absorbed into your image. You want them to just fall in it, like, you know, you're love at first sight. Like, there was a vignette around my wife when I met her, you know, like, oh. That's what we want in these images, right? So we want it to be subtle. This still isn't that subtle. What I suggest about vignettes, if you use vignettes, if you're not comfortable with using them, or if you don't have an action already built to make this automatically for you, is make the vignette, walk away, go get some coffee, come back, and if it looks like you use a vignette, drop the opacity a little bit more. So it's still a little too high. Drop that opacity a little bit more, okay? So now I'm gonna double click on this vignette layer, and what am I gonna use? Not Bevel and Emboss, this is a Blendif class. Come on now, get with it. We're gonna put that color overlay on there so we can see this mask. I mean, it's a very light, we started with pure black. We dropped the opacity down to about 30-some%, and now we're gonna use Blendif to specifically protect our highlights. So I'll go to the blending options, I'll bring this down. And the reason why I protect my highlights, and I protect them really hard, is because, has anyone in here ever done HDR? Okay. I used to have a whole blog devoted to HDR. I was an HDR junkie. It's called everydayhdr.com. I could not get enough of it. It's when I fell in love with photography. So, but now I know there's certain things you just don't do with HDR. And one of those things is taking your highlights too far, because it creates something called tone compression, where you're trying to tell Photoshop or whatever it is that you're using to make that HDR image that this area of white, we need as much of it as we can. So, but if there's nothing there, it's gonna start adding like a yellowish tinge to it and look like, you know, like a yellow snow type thing, and we know to avoid that, right? So what we need to do with this is the same thing with the vignette. If we just put a vignette over top of a highlight and didn't protect the highlight, that highlight area is going to start getting some of that dingy quality to it. So to protect that highlight, we bring this down and we press Alt or Option to split and feather that over. So now the only places that vignette is affecting are the darkest dark areas transitioning into the midtones with a nice split and feather across the way. We'll press OK on here. We've got the color overlay on there so we can see it. And now, is that vignette as evident? Not really. But the cool part is this. If I put a curves adjustment layer on here, this is so cool. And I turn that on, watch what happens. See how that vignette starts to get stronger? Because now this vignette is like a hybrid. It's like fluid, it's like liquid. It's saying, okay, as this changes, I'm gonna change too, because that's how cool I am, because I've got Blendif attached to me. I got that magical pixie fairy dust, whatever you wanna call it, that says you can do anything you want as long as things get darker or lighter underneath. So it has like a mind of its own, essentially. It just follows whatever is underneath it that gets darker and that gets lighter along the way. When it comes to color grading, like this is a portrait that I took of him in my studio for a headshot, and as a headshot, it's probably good. Like I'd probably leave it at that. We did a series of images, but if I want to take this into a more artsy type of realm, or into a more like I don't know, fine art type portrait, rather than just being, hey, this is me, you know, because you don't see me color graded when I walk around. That'd be cool if you did. I'd probably choose like a dark cyan color. It's one of my favorites, but. You know, we can choose that when we get into the fine art realm of things. There's a plethora of ways that you can color grade, and one of my favorite ways to color grade is actually by using something called the gradient map. The gradient map is kind of like a Blendif, so to speak. It thinks about things in terms of 0 to 255. So when I tell this thing to be a gradient map, it's saying, okay, anything that's the darkest dark pixels in this image, you want me to turn black. And anything that's the lightest pixels in this image, you want me to turn white. That's what the gradient map is doing. This, just as another aside, my absolute favorite way of black and white converting, because it makes true black and white conversions. Navy or blue, let's say, is a dark color on the color wheel. If you do a desaturation method of black and white conversion, guess what? Your blue just turns to gray. But this, your blue will be a dark color, or your yellow will be a light color. So this is awesome. It maps out your colors, turns them into tones, if we choose black and white. But if we go really wild and we click on here, and I suggest you make a bunch of gradients if you don't have them, this is saying, okay, you want me to turn your darkest dark colors a purplish magenta, and your lightest light colors this kind of baby blue color. You may not be able to see it very well with this color scheme, but how about this one? Yeesh. You want the darkest dark colors, Blake, because you're crazy, to be blue, and the lightest light colors to be magenta. And that's why we no longer have a black and white look. We're telling white to become magenta. We're telling black to become blue. And it's taking on a whole new mind of its own. Now, I also challenge you, on top of using Blendif and everything that you do, use disgusting gradient maps, okay? Try it, okay? Use the disgust. I'll just do it. I'm going to be brave and use this one. We'll press OK. And I'm going to go right here where it says normal and change this to soft light and see what happens. We start to get a pretty nice looking color scheme. But then we also have opacity, so we can drop that opacity down, okay? And if I were to double click on the gradient map, guess what it has in it? If you haven't realized by now, it's got Blendif in it, okay? We'll double click on that gradient map. If we turn our color overlay on, we can see what's happening. Because we dropped the opacity, that color overlay is not going to be as powerful as it could be. Let's go to our blending options. And let's say I only want this to affect the dark areas on this portrait. So I'll drop this down, say those highlights will no longer get that pink look on you. Sorry, maybe you win, Joey. And we'll press OK. Turn that color overlay off and look at the difference. But the cool thing about this, you click on that gradient map. Now I can change it to any gradient map I want and get a different look on this photograph. Look at that. Look at that one. That's like, whoa, that looks good, man. You actually look a lot better than you do in real life. He is definitely not watching this, I know that. But, you know, when we think about color grading, to me, color grading is the most important step in the image. It's what happens at the end, okay? And you want to pick, you got to be careful about color grading. And I would suggest being in the mood that you want the viewer to be in when you color grade. Ooh. So have you ever thought about editing when you're mad? Typically we don't, because it's not something we want to do. But if you want the viewer to be mad while you're editing, or while they're looking at it, be mad while you're editing. Because then when they see it, they're like, oh, this makes me really uncomfortable, because you're putting yourself into it, right? You're putting your mood, you're putting your emotions into that photograph as you edit that image. So with this image in mind, how do I want the viewer to feel when they see my cousin? Do I want them to feel like that manly cold? Or do I want them to feel more of like that pink tutu type feel? Let's go with that. But it still looks like a pretty good image, right? And the color grading is still nice. But color grading ties everything together. It takes what you do to the highlights. It takes what you do to the midtones. It takes what you do to the shadows throughout your whole editing process. And it ties them together in a nice little bow with a color on it. And that color is typically what you want them to feel when they see it. Like I said before, this is just, you know, maybe a good, not really color graded. My wall is actually that color, so that's why that color is coming through. I didn't do any color grading to this when I was editing this image. But then when I add that color to it, it gets that mood, it gets that feel, it starts to bring things about. Again, think about it this way. Anything that changes underneath there, the color is going to change on there as well, okay? So if we have that gradient map on there, as things get lighter or darker, I just used a different color so you could see it a little bit better, the grading is going to change. So this gradient map was set to red to cyan, so a complementary color. If we bring this down, the whole image is getting darker. So because the whole image is getting darker, more of that red is coming through. So it's really cool to use color grading at the end, because then there's those times where we're like, oh, this looks good, but what if I went all the way back down to this layer and changed it? Well, if you just use a stamp at the top and didn't use any Blendif, you're stuck. But here's the cool part. You use that color grade on the top, anything that you do underneath or anything you have to go back and do, it's going to fluctuate as it needs to, like liquid. And it's just going to go with the flow, just like you, okay? You're looking at me doing this and you're thinking, man, he's doing the same thing over and over again with this Blendif thing, right? Well, you can turn these into actions, okay? And I'm going to show you how to do a couple of them. I'm not going to show you how to do all of them, because then I give away all my secrets. But if you're not familiar with actions, I've done a whole thing on our boot camp here on Creative Live on actions. There's a whole lesson just on creating actions. So I'm going to be rather quick about it because I've already covered that somewhere else. But let's say I wanted to create actions for shadows only, highlights only, no shadows, no highlights, midtones only. You can do that in your actions so that when you put your layer on there, all you got to do is press play and it will automatically have recorded into it the no highlights, no shadows, however you build that, okay? So let's go ahead and just make a new folder here. We'll call this Creative Live Test. It's a test because we don't know if it works yet. Whew. Let's see if we can do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the history and just pop that layer back on there. I'm going to delete that curve because I like what we had going on here. So what this does is with an action, it records everything that you do. So I like to start fresh with an action. I'm going to call this Shadows Only. So if I double click on this layer and record that, don't record yourself clicking on that layer, because then every time you play that action, it's going to look for a gradient map. Well, it's not on there. You got to record yourself already on the layer, double clicking it,